My parents kicked me out of the family business, but when I developed my business better than theirs, they started asking for help. My name's Nick, and I've always been the odd one out in my family. In our household, success wasn't just an expectation. It was a religion. My parents ran a chain of luxury jewelry stores. Think diamond rings that cost more than some people's houses. They loved showing off their achievements at glitzy galas and rubbing elbows with society's elite. I, on the other hand, was their eternal disappointment. From the outside, I suppose it looked like I was the failure they painted me to be. I didn't take over the family business, and I didn't parade around in expensive suits or attend networking events designed for Instagram bragging rights. Instead, I threw myself into what my family mockingly called my little hobby, designing and manufacturing high-end bicycles. I started the business in my garage, piecing together frames, tinkering with designs, and obsessing over every detail. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Over time, my little hobby grew into a $12 million a year enterprise. Did my family care? Not one bit. They couldn't fathom how something as simple as a bicycle could be worth anything, so they dismissed it. The latest family gathering was at my parents' estate, a sprawling mansion that looked like it was plucked straight out of a magazine. My brother, Derek, who'd taken over the jewelry business, was there, along with my sister-in-law, Angela, the queen of fake smiles and passive-aggressive digs. My parents, of course, were hosting with their usual flair for extravagance. As I walked into the room, the air shifted. It always did when I arrived, like I was an unwelcome guest at a party I didn't RSVP to. Derek made some comment about my jeans, casual as always. "Nick, I see you're dressed for the occasion." And Angela laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. I ignored them and focused on the food. If there's one thing these events are good for, it's the catering. I was piling some smoked salmon onto my plate when my mom approached me, a glass of wine in hand and that thin-lipped smile she reserved for me. "Nick, darling," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "How's the bike thing going?" I didn't bother correcting her. Explaining the intricacies of my business to her was like trying to teach a dog to read. "Fine," I replied, keeping it short. "That's nice," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't think it was nice at all. "You know, if you ever want to come back into the family business, there's always a place for you. We could use someone to handle the warehouse inventory." As the evening wore on, the wine flowed, and the fake smiles turned into loose tongues. I was minding my own business, trying to stay out of the fray, when Derek decided to make a toast. "To family," he announced, raising his glass. "And to being a part of something bigger than ourselves. Some of us," he added, glancing at me, "might not understand that, but for the rest of us, it's what matters most." The room erupted in polite laughter, and I felt my jaw tighten. I'd spent years brushing off their jabs, but something about Derek's smug face made me snap. "Funny you should say that," I said, standing up, "because if I'm not mistaken, the family business hasn't exactly been thriving lately, has it?" The room went silent. Derek's face turned red, and my mom looked like she was about to combust. "What are you talking about?" Derek demanded. "Oh, come on," I said, crossing my arms. "Everyone knows the stores are struggling. You're hanging on by a thread, but you're too proud to admit it. Meanwhile, my little hobby is worth more than your entire chain." The explosion was immediate. Derek launched into a tirade about how I didn't understand the pressures of running a real business. My mom started crying, her go-to move whenever the family's image was threatened, and my dad just sat there, stone-faced, as if willing the argument to end. But I wasn't done. "You all think you're so superior," I said, my voice rising. "But the truth is, you've been living in a bubble your whole lives. You look down on me because I didn't follow your path, but at least I built something real, something I'm proud of. Can any of you say the same?" Angela tried to step in, but Derek cut her off. "Get out," he snarled. "If you hate us so much, why are you even here?" A week after the blowout at the family gathering, my father, Robert, summoned us all for what he called a family meeting. It came in the form of a formal email, something he rarely used, with a subject line that read, "Discussion of urgent family matters." The tone was unmistakable. This wasn't optional. The meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at the estate, which, in my father's world, translated to a mandatory audience with the king. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of facing everyone again after the last fiasco, but a part of me was curious. My father wasn't the type to waste time on drama, so whatever this was, it had to be serious. When I arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. My father was seated at the head of the massive dining table, his expression stony and severe. Derek was on his right, looking smug as ever, and next to him was Julia, my sister, with her perfectly styled hair and clipboard in hand. Sean, my youngest brother, was scrolling on his phone, but even he looked more tense than usual. Garrett, my other brother, sat with his arms crossed, a rare scowl on his face. The second I walked in, every pair of eyes zeroed in on me. It felt like walking into an ambush. My father cleared his throat, the universal sign that he was about to deliver a decree. "Nick," he began, his voice sharp and authoritative. "We've called this meeting because your recent behavior has crossed a line. Your actions at the last gathering were unacceptable and have disgraced this family's heritage." I blinked at him, stunned by his audacity. "Disgraced the family heritage?" I repeated, incredulous. "By speaking the truth? By making a spectacle of yourself?" Derek interjected, his voice dripping with contempt. "You embarrassed all of us, and you insulted everything this family has built." "Oh, you mean the failing business you're desperately clinging to?" I shot back. Derek's face reddened, but before he could respond, Julia stepped in. She slid a sleek black folder across the table toward me. "This," she said, her voice cold and precise, "is a formal document severing all ties between you and the family business. It also officially removes you from the list of heirs." The room went silent as I stared at the folder. It sat there like a loaded gun, and everyone waited to see what I would do. My father watched me with a mixture of disappointment and expectation, Derek with smug satisfaction, and Julia with icy detachment. Sean glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable, while Garrett's scowl deepened. I picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside were pages of legal jargon, all designed to make one thing clear. I was no longer a part of the family legacy. I skimmed the documents, noting the signatures already at the bottom. My father's, Derek's, Julia's. They'd all agreed to this. "Wow," I said, looking up. "You really went all out, huh? Was this Derek's idea or yours, Dad?" "It doesn't matter whose idea it was," my father said firmly. "What matters is that you've left us no choice. You've made it clear that you don't value what this family stands for." "What this family stands for," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You mean pretending everything's perfect while you all stab each other in the back?" "No thanks," Julia bristled, but I ignored her and grabbed a pen. Without a moment's hesitation, I signed my name at the bottom of the document. The room collectively gasped. "Nick," my father barked, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, shoving the folder back across the table. "I'm freeing myself from all of you. Consider this my final gift to the family legacy." Derek looked stunned. He clearly hadn't expected me to call their bluff. Julia's expression flickered for the first time, a brief flash of disbelief before her usual composure returned. Sean muttered something under his breath, and Garrett finally spoke up. "Are you sure about this?" Garrett asked, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "Once you sign, there's no going back." "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "If that's how you feel, then you're no son of mine," he said, his voice heavy with finality. For a moment, the weight of his words hung in the air, but I refused to let them crush me. I stood up, meeting his glare head-on. "Maybe I never was," I said, turning on my heel and walking out. As I left, I heard Julia whisper something to Derek and my father muttering under his breath, but I didn't look back. I'd spent my whole life chasing their approval, and for what? To be treated like an outsider in my own family? It wasn't worth it. When I reached my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, I was free. After signing away my ties to the family, I threw myself entirely into my business. I wasn't just building bikes anymore. I was crafting art. My bicycles weren't meant for weekend rides in the park. They were precision-engineered masterpieces built to last a lifetime. Each one was a unique creation, tailored to the client's exact specifications, and they came with a price tag to match. Prices started at $25,000 and climbed as high as $200,000 for the most customized models. What started as a quiet passion project had grown into something far more significant. My workshop, a sleek, industrial space on the edge of the city, became the beating heart of my operation. I had a small but fiercely dedicated team. Clara, my lead designer, who had an eye for aesthetics that rivaled the best artists. Marco, our engineer, who could make even the wildest ideas a reality. And Jenna, my operations manager, who kept everything running smoothly. We were a well-oiled machine, and together we built bikes that were nothing short of extraordinary. My clientele was a who's who of the rich and famous. Actors, CEOs, professional athletes, they all wanted a piece of what we were creating. One of my earliest clients was Sam Rodriguez, a professional basketball player who wanted a bike as unique as he was. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw the finished product, a sleek, jet black frame with gold accents and his jersey number etched into the handlebars. He couldn't stop raving about it, and his social media post showing off the bike brought in a flood of inquiries. Things really took off after that. Word spread quickly, and soon I was getting calls from people I'd only seen on TV or read about in Forbes. One day, I got an email from a name I didn't recognize, Paul Langston. The subject line read, "Feature Opportunity." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made me open it. Turns out, Paul was a senior editor at Innovator magazine, one of the most respected publications in the world of design and technology. He wanted to do a feature on me and my business. The interview was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at the workshop. Paul showed up with a photographer, a wiry guy named Tim who spent most of the day circling our space with his camera, snapping shots of everything from our tools to the bikes in progress. Paul, meanwhile, peppered me with questions about my process, my inspiration, and my journey. He was particularly interested in how I'd managed to build such a successful business despite coming from a family that had written me off. "What drives you?" he asked, leaning forward in his chair, pen poised over his notebook. I thought about it for a moment. "I think it's the desire to create something meaningful," I said, "something that people will cherish. My family was all about status and appearances, but I've always believed in substance over flash. These bikes," I gestured to the workshop around me, "they're not just products. They're experiences." When the article was published, it was like throwing gasoline on an already roaring fire. The headline read, "Nick Hayes, Reinventing Luxury on Two Wheels." The feature was full of glossy photos of my bikes and glowing praise for our craftsmanship. It didn't just bring in attention, it brought in business. Within a week, we were flooded with orders. My inbox was overflowing, and Jenna was fielding so many calls that she joked about needing a second phone. One of the most surprising inquiries came from a tech billionaire named David Grayson. He was known for being notoriously private, so when his assistant reached out to commission a bike, I was both excited and cautious. David wanted something truly one-of-a-kind, a bike that integrated cutting-edge technology with timeless design. It was a challenge unlike anything we'd done before, but I couldn't resist. We spent months working on David's bike, a stunning piece of engineering that featured a carbon fiber frame, embedded LED lights, and a built-in GPS system that was practically invisible to the naked eye. When we delivered it to his estate, he was so impressed that he ordered 3 more, one for each of his homes around the world. As the business grew, so did the challenges. Scaling up without sacrificing quality was a delicate balancing act. We had to hire more people, expand the workshop, and streamline our processes without losing the personal touch that made our bikes special. It was stressful, but it was the kind of stress I thrived on. Every time I walked into the workshop and saw the team hard at work, I felt a surge of pride. This was mine, something I'd built from the ground up. The success didn't go unnoticed. One day, I got a call from someone I never expected to hear from again, Julia. Her tone was sugary sweet, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "Nick," she said, "I saw the article about you. Very impressive. It's wonderful to see you doing so well." "Thanks," I said, not bothering to hide my skepticism. "What do you want, Julia?" She hesitated for a moment. "I was wondering if you'd consider collaborating with the family business. Your bikes and our jewelry. It could be a perfect match." I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "You must be joking." "I'm serious," she insisted. "We've been struggling and—" I cut her off. "And you think I'd want to bail you out after everything you've done? Not a chance, Julia." She started to protest, but I hung up. I didn't have time for her or anyone else who doubted me. I was too busy doing what they'd all thought I couldn't, succeeding on my own terms. As orders continued to pour in, I realized that my business wasn't just a success. It was a phenomenon. We started getting offers from investors, licensing deals, and even a reality show. I turned most of them down, determined to keep our focus on what mattered, the bikes. But it was hard not to feel a sense of vindication. For years, my family had treated me like an embarrassment. Now, they couldn't ignore me, and I didn't need their approval. I'd built something far better than their hollow legacy ever could be. The messages started trickling in a few months after I had completely severed ties with my family. At first, I ignored them, brushing them off as some half-hearted attempt at reconnection. But the frequency and the desperation soon became impossible to overlook. The first message was from Julia. It came late one night, popping up on my phone while I was reviewing design specs for a new client. The subject line read, "Urgent. We need to talk." For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the delete button. But something about the word urgent caught my attention. Julia wasn't the type to use that word lightly, especially not with me. Against my better judgment, I opened the email. "Nick, I know you don't want to hear from me, but this is important. The family business is in serious trouble. We need to talk. Please." I didn't respond. Whatever mess they'd gotten themselves into, it wasn't my problem anymore. I'd made that clear when I signed away my inheritance and walked out of their lives. They had Derek and their precious legacy. They didn't need me. Or so I thought. A week later, I got another message. This time it was from Garrett. It was short and cryptic, just a single line. There must have been some kind of mistake. "We need to meet." I didn't reply to him, either. Garrett and I had never been close. He was the quiet one, always lurking in the background, letting Julia and Derek do the talking. If he was reaching out now, it meant things were worse than I'd thought. The final message came from the one person I never expected to hear from, my father. Robert Hayes, the man who had practically disowned me, sent a text message of all things. No greeting, no explanation, just 5 terse words. "Come home. We need you." I read it over and over, trying to decipher his tone. My father wasn't the kind of man to admit defeat, let alone ask for help. If he was reaching out to me, it meant they were truly desperate. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to ignore them all, to let them stew in the mess they'd made. But another part of me, the part that had spent years seeking their approval, even when I knew better, couldn't let it go. Against my better judgment, I decided to see what they wanted. When I arrived at the estate, the first thing I noticed was how different it felt. The house that had once buzzed with life and activity now felt hollow and quiet. The grand facade, with its perfectly manicured lawns and gleaming windows, seemed almost sad, like a facade that had outlived its purpose. My father was waiting for me in his study, the room where he'd once lectured me about the importance of tradition and responsibility. He looked older than I remembered, his hair thinner and his posture less rigid. For the first time in my life, he seemed tired. "Nick," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Thank you for coming." I didn't respond. I just stood there, waiting for him to explain why he dragged me back here. He gestured for me to sit, but I stayed where I was. "The business is in trouble," he admitted finally. "We've been hit with a series of setbacks, supplier issues, declining sales, bad press. Derek's been trying to hold things together, but it's not enough." I raised an eyebrow. "And you think I can fix it?" "I think you're the only one who can," he said, surprising me with his candor. Before I could respond, Julia and Garrett walked in. Julia looked frazzled, her usual composure replaced by an anxious energy that made her seem almost unrecognizable. Garrett, as always, was quiet, but there was a tension in his jaw that spoke volumes. "Nick," Julia began, her voice strained. "We need you. The business, it's falling apart. Derek won't admit it, but he's out of his depth. If we don't do something soon, we'll lose everything." I couldn't help but laugh. "So now you want my help? After everything you said, after cutting me out, now you're coming to me for a bailout?" "It's not like that," Julia insisted. "We made a mistake, okay? We were wrong about you. But you're still part of this family, and we need you." "Do I look like I care about the family legacy?" I shot back. "You made it clear I was never really part of it." "Nick," Garrett said quietly, speaking for the first time, "we know we screwed up, but this isn't just about us. There are hundreds of employees who depend on this business, people who will lose their jobs if we go under. You can save them." That gave me pause. As much as I hated to admit it, he had a point. The jewelry business wasn't just about my family. It was about the people who worked for them, people who had nothing to do with our petty squabbles. Before I could respond, Derek stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell is he doing here?" he demanded, glaring at me. "He's here because we need him," Julia snapped. "Something you're too proud to admit." "I don't need him," Derek spat. "This is my business. I can handle it." "Clearly you can't," I said, crossing my arms. "Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Derek lunged toward me, but my father stepped between us, his voice rising for the first time. "Enough. This isn't about pride or ego. This is about saving what's left of this family." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over us. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my father turned to me, his expression pleading. "Nick," he said softly, "please, help us." I stared at him, at Julia, at Garrett, and even at Derek. For the first time, they all looked genuinely vulnerable. It was a strange feeling, seeing them like this, like the walls they'd built around themselves had finally crumbled. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice cold and distant. "But don't expect me to save you without a price." With that, I turned and walked out, leaving them to stew in their desperation. For once, the power was in my hands, and I wasn't about to let them forget it. It was a chilly morning when my father showed up unannounced at my workshop. I was in the middle of reviewing some prototypes with Clara and Marco when Jenna walked in, looking uncomfortable. "Nick, there's someone here to see you," she said. Her tone was enough to tell me it wasn't just a client. When I walked out to the front of the workshop, there he was, Robert Hayes, the man who had once told me I wasn't fit to bear the family name. He looked out of place among the sleek metal frames and industrial decor, his tailored suit a glaring contrast to the practical workwear my team and I sported. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence noticeably absent. "Nick," he said finally, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. "Haven't we already done this dance?" "I'm not interested." "Please," he said, his tone almost pleading. "Just hear me out." I led him to my office, a modest space cluttered with sketches and tools. He sat down across from me, his posture stiff. For a moment, he just looked around, taking in the space that I had built from the ground up. There was a strange look in his eyes, something between regret and awe. "I was wrong about you," he said finally. "About everything." I raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide my skepticism. "Is that so?" He nodded, his expression grave. "I made a mistake, many mistakes. I let my pride blind me to what really matters. And now I'm paying the price for it. We all are." I waited, letting the silence stretch out until he finally continued. "The business is falling apart, Nick. Derek doesn't know what he's doing, and Julia, well, she's not equipped to handle this kind of pressure. We're on the brink of losing everything. And I know you're the only one who can save us." There it was, the admission I never thought I'd hear. For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to process the weight of his words. This was the man who had spent years belittling me, dismissing me, and now he was sitting here, asking for my help. "Why should I help you?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. "You've made it clear that I was never good enough for this family. What's changed?" "You've changed," he said simply. "You've built something incredible. I see that now, and I respect it." "I respect you." I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter sound that echoed in the small room. "You're a little late to the party, Dad." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here now, and I'm asking you, not as your father, but as a man who has no other options, please help us." I leaned back in my chair, considering his words. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to let him and the rest of the family deal with the mess they'd made. But another part of me, the part that still craved some form of validation, couldn't let it go. "I'll help," I said finally, "but on one condition." "Anything," he said quickly, his eyes lighting up with hope. "I want full control," I said. "If I'm going to fix this, I'm doing it my way. That means no interference, no second-guessing, and no power struggles. And one more thing. You, Derek, Julia, and Garrett, you all work for me now." His eyes widened in shock. "You want us to be your employees?" "Exactly," I said. "If I'm going to save this company, I need everyone to understand who's in charge. If you can't accept that, I'm walking away." He was silent for a long time, his jaw clenched. I could see the internal battle playing out in his mind. Finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice barely audible. "You have my word." With that, the deal was struck. I didn't waste any time. The next day, I walked into the family's corporate office, a sleek glass building that seemed far less imposing than it had in my youth. The staff greeted me with a mix of curiosity and wariness, their whispers trailing me as I made my way to the conference room. Inside, the rest of the family was waiting. Derek looked furious. Julia was visibly anxious, and Garrett, as usual, was unreadable. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression resigned. "Let's get one thing straight," I said, placing my hands on the table and leaning forward. "I'm in charge now. If any of you have a problem with that, there's the door." Derek immediately stood up, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't just waltz in here and take over." "I can, and I have. I said calmly. You had your chance, Derek. You blew it. Now it's my turn. Julia tried to smooth things over, her voice trembling slightly. Nick, we just want what's best for the company. And what's best for the company is a complete overhaul, I interrupted. The old way of doing things clearly isn't working. It's time for a fresh start. Over the next few weeks, I began the process of dismantling and rebuilding the business from the ground up. I brought in new talent, replaced outdated systems, and rebranded the company to appeal to a younger, more modern audience. The transition wasn't easy, and there was plenty of pushback, especially from Derek, but I stayed firm. One of the most significant changes I made was introducing a profit-sharing program for employees. I wanted to create a culture of collaboration and loyalty, something the company had been sorely lacking. The staff responded enthusiastically, and morale began to improve almost immediately. As for my family, they struggled to adjust to their new roles. My father worked in an advisory capacity, a shadow of his former self. Julia handled marketing, Garrett oversaw operations, and Derek, begrudgingly, was relegated to a sales position. Watching him answer to me was a small but satisfying victory. Through it all, I maintained a clear boundary. This was business, not family. I wasn't interested in mending old wounds or rekindling relationships. I was here to save the company, nothing more. By the end of the first quarter under my leadership, profits had already begun to recover. The board, which had been skeptical of my appointment, was now singing my praises. For the first time in years, the future of the business looked bright. And for the first time, I felt like I had finally proven my worth, not to them, but to myself. The first order of business was to stop the bleeding. When I took over, the company was hemorrhaging money, mostly due to poor management and an outdated business model. It was clear that drastic measures were needed, and I wasn't about to let sentimentality get in the way. The first step was evaluating the store portfolio. My father and Derek had clung to the idea that more stores meant more success, but in reality, many of them were operating at a loss. The data didn't lie. Nearly a third of the locations were dead weight, pulling resources away from the stores that actually performed well. It wasn't an easy decision, but it had to be done. I called a meeting with the management team, laying out the cold, hard facts. These stores are losing money every single day, I said, pointing to a spreadsheet projected on the screen. If we keep them open, they'll drag the whole company down. We have to close them. There was some pushback, of course. Julia argued that closing so many stores would damage the brand's image, while Derek, predictably, accused me of trying to destroy the family legacy. I'm not destroying anything, I shot back. I'm saving what's left. You can either get on board, or you can get out of the way. In the end, I got my way. Over the course of 3 months, we shut down 15 underperforming stores, a move that saved the company millions in operating costs. But I didn't stop there. The remaining stores needed a complete overhaul. The old locations were relics of a bygone era, overly ornate and cluttered, more focused on flaunting wealth than creating a welcoming customer experience. I wanted something entirely different. Working with a cutting-edge design firm, I transformed the stores into minimalist showrooms with clean lines, open spaces, and carefully curated displays. The goal was to make the jewelry the star of the show, not the decor. To bring this vision to life, I enlisted the help of a designer named Mia Larson. She had a reputation for creating sleek, modern retail spaces that felt both luxurious and approachable. Together, we worked on every detail, from the layout of the displays to the lighting that would make the diamonds sparkle just right. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Customers loved the new look, and foot traffic in the redesigned stores increased by 35% in the first month alone. While the stores were being revamped, I turned my attention to the company's online presence. The website was a disaster, clunky, outdated, and difficult to navigate. In an age where e-commerce was king, it was a glaring weakness. I decided to scrap it entirely and start from scratch. I hired a web development agency that specialized in luxury brands, sparing no expense to ensure the site would be a seamless extension of the new in-store experience. The process took 6 months and cost over $250,000, but the results were worth every penny. The new site was sleek, intuitive, and optimized for mobile shopping. It featured high-resolution images, interactive product customization tools, and even a virtual try-on feature that let customers see how a piece of jewelry would look on them. When the new site launched, online sales skyrocketed. Within 3 months, revenue from e-commerce had increased by 400%. For the first time, the company was competing in the digital marketplace, and customers were taking notice. The final piece of the puzzle was the product itself. The old collections were uninspired, relying on the same tired designs that had been popular decades ago. They appealed to an older, wealthier demographic, but they didn't resonate with younger customers. I knew we needed something fresh, something that would capture the attention of a new generation. That's when I had the idea for an eco-friendly collection. Sustainability was a growing trend in the luxury market, and I saw an opportunity to set the company apart from its competitors. To make it happen, I brought in a new creative director, a young designer named Ethan Blake who had made a name for himself with his innovative use of recycled materials. Together, we developed a collection that combined elegance with sustainability. The pieces were crafted from ethically sourced gemstones and recycled metals, with a portion of the proceeds going to environmental charities. When the collection launched, it was an instant hit. Influencers and celebrities raved about the designs on social media, and sales exceeded our projections by 200%. Young customers flocked to the brand, drawn not just by the product but by the message behind it. The success of the eco-friendly collection marked a turning point for the company. For the first time in years, we were no longer playing catch-up. We were leading the way. Through it all, my family watched in awe. My father, once so skeptical of my abilities, began to treat me with a newfound respect. Julia and Garrett adapted to their new roles, embracing the changes I had implemented. Even Derek, though still resentful, couldn't argue with the results. For the first time, I felt like I had finally proven my worth, not to them, but to myself. 9 months after I took the reins, the transformation was undeniable. The company that had been on the brink of collapse was now thriving, achieving its best financial performance in 2 decades. The quarterly reports didn't just show growth, they showed a rebirth. Revenue was up across the board, from online sales to in-store purchases, and the new eco-friendly collection was outselling everything else by a wide margin. The day of the family meeting, I walked into the boardroom with a sense of calm confidence that I'd never felt before in this house. The room was packed, not just with family but with senior staff and a few key investors who had stuck with us through the tough times. My father sat at the head of the table, as he always did, but the energy in the room was different. There was no tension, no underlying hostility, just anticipation. I started the meeting the way I always did, with the numbers. Jenna had helped me prepare a detailed presentation, complete with charts and projections, and I walked them through every metric. Revenue was up by 42%, operating costs had been reduced by nearly 30%, and customer satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. But the most impressive stat was this. For the first time in 20 years, the company's profit margins had exceeded the industry average. When I finished, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't polite or perfunctory, it was genuine. For a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. This was a far cry from the icy stares and muttered insults I'd grown up with. After the applause died down, my father stood. He was wearing one of his signature tailored suits, but even that couldn't hide how much he had aged in the past year. His once imposing figure seemed smaller somehow, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Nick," he began, looking directly at me. "I want to say something I should have said a long time ago. I'm proud of you. What you've done here. It's something none of us could have imagined." I blinked, caught off guard by the emotion in his voice. My father was not a man who handed out compliments, let alone admissions of failure. But there he was, standing in front of a room full of people, giving me the recognition I had stopped expecting years ago. "You've not only saved this company," he continued, "but you've made it better than it's ever been. You've shown us what real leadership looks like." There was a lump in my throat, but I swallowed it down, nodding in acknowledgement. I wasn't about to let my guard down, not yet. Then Julia stood up, her usual polished demeanor softened by something that looked almost like remorse. "Nick," she said, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated you. We all did. I've spent so much time trying to hold on to the past that I didn't see what you were building. But I see it now, and thank you." Garrett, ever the quiet one, added his voice to the mix. "She's right," he said simply. "I didn't think you had it in you, but you proved me wrong. And I'm glad you did." Even Derek, who had been sullen and resentful throughout most of the transition, managed to muster a grudging nod. "You've done a hell of a job," he said, his tone lacking its usual bite. It was a surreal moment. For years, I had been the black sheep, the outcast, the one who could never measure up. And now, here they were, admitting they had been wrong. Part of me wanted to bask in the validation, to throw their past words and actions back in their faces. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger and wiser over the past 9 months, just felt relieved. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice steady. "But let's not forget that this wasn't just me. This was a team effort. None of this would have been possible without the incredible people I've been lucky enough to work with. If we're going to keep moving forward, we need to keep that in mind. The rest of the meeting was a blur of discussions and congratulations, but one moment stood out. As the room began to clear, my father approached me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "I mean it, Nick," he said finally. "I'm proud of you. I haven't said that enough, or ever, really, but I am. You've done something incredible here." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The wounds of the past didn't disappear overnight, but hearing those words was a start. For the first time, it felt like the weight of their expectations, and my own insecurities, was finally lifting. As I left the boardroom and stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, and I took a deep breath. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a milestone, a moment I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And for the first time, I felt like I had finally proven my worth not to them, but to myself.